Hey guys, and welcome back to City Skylines Canada. Today we'll be working a bit on the King Harbour Promenade and building some urban green spaces between Blackpool Street and Lethbridge Street. This episode is going to be a bit different because I bought a new screen in the middle of making the video and it has a different aspect ratio than my old screen. And video editing with two different ratios is a lot of work and looks awkward. So I've just decided to not include any cinematics in this video and just have the time-lapse I recorded before the screen change. Which is also why this bridge clip is something you've already seen in episode 3. Anyhow, onto the build. So we're starting off with this group of 3 condos on Pacific Boulevard. These 3 are all one development, and I didn't like how Alexander Graham Bell Street ran through the middle of said development. So I've decided to convert the last segment of Graham Bell Street into a pedestrianized area with a bikeway. Now I'm just using the PO podiums that I created at the end of episode 5 to finalize the buildings on these blocks. These areas will be mixed use once I add the block services under the PO buildings. After that I used Traffic Manager President Edition to ensure that no cars go into the bikeway, and these 2 little laneways end up connecting to some parking garage entrances that I'm placing here. I did end up doing most of the intersection detailing for this area off camera. Now I just placed some signage and further pedestrian protections at the exits of the area, and placing ploppable surfaces like asphalt on these laneways was actually very difficult, as they don't conform to terrain in the same manner as other roads. I placed some food trucks and tables to make it nice and touristy, and then I just covered the area with some trees. Which I'll probably end up replacing because, to be honest, I'd like some trees that actually let you see the details. Now here for this small little transit center on Pacific Boulevard, I'm pasting the same tram stops that I used over on Viola Desmond Parkway with Melbourne Avenue. And then I used PO to change the signage to match its location. I've done this for all of my transit stops so far, and I figured I'd include the footage this time so y'all can see how I do it. Now I really didn't like how the PO condo that I'd made looked in the block between Aurora Street and Terry Fox Avenue, as it just made the area look unrealistic. So I've instead put in this condo which has the same glass textures as the majority of the area, which really does increase just how Vancouver-like King Harbour looks. Now I'm moving on to detailing the promenade portion of Mackenzie King Park, and I've just placed these PO'd massive event tents, and I didn't detail much about them, but they do look rather striking when viewed from the bridge. The final stretch of the Pacific Line, which is a tram line, is on the King Harbour Promenade, and here I've added the first stop of 3, which is the Mackenzie King Park stop, as it is where the main body of the park is. Now I wanted to place planters, but I couldn't put massive trees like I have on the boulevard, so I instead went with these long lines of magnolia flower trees because they didn't segment the area that much. Now I'm placing the King Harbour Promenade tram stop, which is right next to the road with the bus lanes, and I basically follow the same pattern of magnolia trees and benches all the way along the promenade, and ultimately the look is rather consistent and nice. As you've probably already read on the tram sign, at the end of the park and on the corner of the peninsula, I'll be placing a relatively sizable ferry terminal, which would serve as another link across the water. To make the building, I took an inner city bus terminal, which is a very brutalist looking concrete building, and removed the lettering and platforms with PO. Then, because the building looked a bit too old, I used Senfcorn's modular office park set to add to the building and make it look like it had recently been refurbished. Finally, I added a little, maybe unrealistic control tower that ensures that the building makes a visual impact on the area. Originally, I wanted to make the piers a U-shape, like the large vanilla ferry station, but that shape doesn't really lend itself to the geographical position of the terminal at the corner of the peninsula, so I ended up going with a U-shape. I didn't detail this or finish Mackenzie King Park before I switched screens, so you'll have to see the conclusion of this build in the next episode of Canada. Now I've moved on to the area you saw in the thumbnail, which is the 2 blocks on either side of Pacific Boulevard all the way from the shoreline to Lethbridge Street. I've just added some more condos, and it gets harder each time to make them at least a bit unique. For this one, I've taken a condo asset by Smiley's that I used literally 1 block away, and used PO to bring the separate roof down, taking away the distinctive silhouette of the condo and turning it into something very generic. Then I used some roof networks to completely distinguish the buildings. I'll be using 2 of these, one on either side of the rails, and just to further emphasize the hill, I ended up making them different heights. All the way along the north side of Aurora Street here, I'll be having green spaces and parks in a manner similar to the Esplanade in Toronto, which is a long line of parks, and it'll have a separate bike path next to the sidewalk. I did this so that the buildings could be more properly surrounded by trees in a manner very evocative of Vancouver, or even some areas of Toronto. For this block here I placed a playground, and then I just surrounded it with a bunch of trees after removing some of the more obtrusive props. I also ended up replacing the block with a parking garage in the background with an underground parking entrance and a park. But unfortunately my recording software failed me, but oh well, it was just some paths and trees like this block here. Since I'm using my sand texture from Theme Mixture for the snow on my white-capped mountains, I had to use the ruin texture and then a decal to achieve a somewhat nice look for the ground around the park. Once I add grasses around the edges, it will come together a lot nicer. If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want early access and a bunch of other benefits, you can support my channel on my Patreon, which is linked down below. Over here, I'm almost done placing all the trees, and for this area I decided to go with placing the trees everywhere instead of in bunches, because I wanted at least these 2 blocks to have a more forested feel to them. For the next block over, the presence of the metro and the steep hill led me to decide to just not include any paths beyond the sidewalk and the bike path. This block here by the Otter building is a bit more for public use in terms of what's in the park and how much space is left exposed, because it's not directly part of the Esplanade line. So I've placed some gazebos and space for some parking. Now finally I'm just detailing this area with retaining walls and trees, and there's nothing to it. That is all for today, and my next video will be decided by the patrons in terms of if it will be a guide or a Canada video. But definitely, at least in the next episode of Canada, we'll be filling in all the gaps left behind by this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time in Canada.